Welcome to the Simple Questions podcast. This is your host, Dylan Carnahan. The question for this episode is, what is stop motion animation? You will learn in this episode the amount of animation that can get completed in a day, essential animation tools, and the various subtypes of stop motion animation. Our guests, that's right, we have two. Our guests are both Emmy Award-winning animation professionals, have worked on projects independently for network shows such as Robot Chicken, SuperMansion, SpongeBob Squarepants, Dinosaur Office, Mad, as well as feature films like Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, and the owners of Threadwood, which is a boutique animation studio located in upstate New York. I introduce to you Alexis Deprey and Scott DaRos. About 15 years ago, I was a little bit younger and I was watching a couple animated films and I got some itch. I said, hey, this is kind of an interesting format. I'm not an actor. I don't have other actors. I can kind of like create what I see in my mind, and I can, I got enough sculpting ability to make a little clay person. So I kind of made some stop motion animations, and I'm sure some, the Sherlock Holmes portion of the audience base here could easily find those on YouTube, again, 15 years ago. But that was kind of my first introduction and kind of thought about like stop motion animation all those years ago. So I'm curious for the two of you, what initially drew each of you to stop motion animation as a form of creative expression?
You want me to go?
Yeah, you can go first. Yours is younger, so.
Yeah, I started as a kid because me and my friend Evan, we would get together and we'd create movies together. And our favorite thing to do was to make like movies out of G.I. Joes. These weren't like structured movies. They were just like us playing with G.I. Joes in front of a camera. And then we wanted to figure out ways to get our hands out of the scene. So we would like hang them on fishing line out of frame, or we'd like we'd be holding their feet out of frame. And then there was one time we were doing this shot, and one of the G.I. Joes in the background kept falling over every time we'd go to start it. So we kept like stopping, fixing him. He'd fall over, stop it, fix him. And then we were watching it back. And then we saw this little character move like a little bit in the background, like on its own, because we had kept moving it a little bit every time we stood him back up. So then along with that same friend at his house, we had watched Creature Comforts by Aardman together, the claymation. Yeah. Like animals using just like regular audio of people talking. And I must have been just talking to my mom and my dad about how much I liked that show and how me and Evan had figured out this little G.I. Joe thing. And so then my mom bought me a brick of Sculpey clay. And then I also started making little stop motion movies on my own with our family camcorder, just like pressing record, pause, move the clay, record, pause, move it, record, pause, move it. So it's kind of funny if you play it back, it's like the audio is insane because I was like recording next to a TV. So it's like all these little tiny clips of audio from different shows and stuff.
And you have it cut together as baby's first demo reel.
Right. I also have those posted, I think on Vimeo, like my first animations. And then, when you're a kid and stuff and you go into like high school and college, you sort of like, in my mind, that wasn't a possibility as a career or anything like that. So I just kind of set it aside, and then I was doing illustration, so still artwork. And then eventually my illustration professor connected me with a guy who was doing stop motion animated ads for a furniture company. And then I picked back up my hobby of stop motion, and then like from then on it's been my career.
That's awesome. Bob's Discount Furniture. Shout out to Bob's Discount Furniture.
Yes.
That, Alexis, how is your kind of exposure compared to that?
Mine was a little later. I was always like an animation kid. Like you could sit me in front of animation for weeks on end and I'd be totally fine. I didn't realize there was much difference between like mediums of animation. So like I didn't realize that I also love stop motion. Like Paddington Bear was like one of my favorite things as a little kid. And I didn't know that that was stop motion. But when I was in college, we had the same professor, though we were a few years apart. And we were both illustration majors. So she was like, by my class was like, okay, enough with a watercolor and a colored pencil. Like, can someone please do something else? Like, we need to expand upon this medium a little bit more. So I started doing like some 3D illustrations. And then my senior thesis, I kept going with that. And I basically just revived old like Barbie toys and made my own puppets and costumes. And so I did like a whole children's book, just like shooting different scenes. And I had no idea that I was like 2 steps away from, stop motion.
Yeah.
Until she also put me in touch with the same boss at Bob's Discount Furniture, which is where we met. And so that was my like first foray into stop motion also. And it's just about the time, it was like very kismet timing because it's just about the time that Coraline came out in 2009. So the industry itself was just shifting into this like very digital, very much easier to work in medium, like Dragon Frame, which is the software that we use to shoot and capture everything, was developed like just before we had started working at Bob's, or just about that time. So we both learned like the older technique first, and then like got to learn the new software like as it was available for the next generation of stop motion filmmakers. So it was very fortuitous timing.
Yeah, that's awesome. You kind of have the barriers to entry drop a little bit. There's some new technology. And then also, I think there's something to be said for the courage, it takes to kind of step out, especially, Scott, you mentioned, not everyone, I do think as we grow up, we kind of put our blinders up, especially going through the, college, educational institutions, it kind of strips away a little bit, and to kind of revisit that and then do that as a profession, I think that's extremely noble of the two of you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is like, because especially like we both grew up in Connecticut and I grew up in a very small town. And so Hollywood and the entertainment industry just seems like it's on a different planet. Like you're never going to be able to do anything there. But then I think when I got that job at the furniture company and I started learning stuff, and my boss was guiding me like along the way, different techniques and stuff. And then like, as you get better, you can start comparing yourself to like the professional work that you're seeing. And you're like, I'm not that far off from like the professional level work. And so I just keep
adding more tools to your toolkit.
Yeah, have the confidence that you're going to keep improving. And then eventually you'll get to that level where you can get take the next
job.
Step.
Yeah. Keep honing your skill set until you can kind of market it and get into just keep progressing, leveling up, right?
Yeah,
level it up.
And a lot of it also is networking. Like, we were very lucky, like stop motion is such a small industry that our old boss, Mike Bannon, used to have his own stop motion company in Connecticut prior to working at Bob's. And so like he had hired a few folks, I don't know, maybe 10 years prior to us, 10 or 15 years prior. So there was like a little stop motion enclave in Connecticut before, we were out of school or anything like that. But all of those people then left and worked on things like Celebrity Deathmatch or, things up in Portland. So like, this is kind of what happens in stop motion is the team kind of reconfigures all the time and people move around for different work. But some of those folks who had previously worked for him moved on to Robot Chicken and then had started a new company with the people who created Robot Chicken. So that's why we ended up moving out to LA, was because we had this very tenuous connection from Connecticut to LA.
Yeah, you have that community, and once that community kind of disperses, you can kind of leverage those mutual connections. Oh, I know someone out here or someone that works there, and then that kind of, again, as you progress, there's kind of more doors that open up through that.
Absolutely. And like it keeps happening over and over again because it's a very like moving, heavy like industry. So people kind of end up all over the place, and the more people you meet, the wider your network is without you even really realizing it.
Yeah. And I would kind of call back. I know the listeners, we just had a previous episode with Kamal Chung about, challenges that entrepreneurs face. I think a big recurring theme here that you hear from a lot of guests and people on the podcast is do it.
Yeah.
Just do it. I think, again, something seems so far away, Hollywood, kind of all of these things. And again, here another testament to the fact, hey, if you do something, you'd be amazed at how far you can go with it.
Yeah. And share and talk about what you're doing. Like, you want to be able to finally like reach the people who can help you get that next step like forward, because especially like I'm sure other industries are friendly too, but because this one's so small, we really do need to be very friendly because we work in close proximity to each other when we're on bigger teams. So it's one of those where like you don't want to be the jerk on the team. If you're friendly, if you're gregarious, if you can pick up skills and you're translating those things in real time, people want to continue to work with you, and they also want to help you get your foot in the door if you've been communicating with them outside of being like, hey, do you have any tips or anything like that? I love your work, I'd love to progress a little bit.
Yeah, your reputation. Got to have your reputation. Okay, I'm gonna hit you with some basic stuff. All right.
Okay.
Again, we got some novices listening here.
Sure.
We're going. First off, how would you define stop motion animation, and what makes it unique compared to other animation techniques?
Well, stop motion is basically taking photographs of physical objects in a sequence. And then when you compile those together, it creates the illusion of fluid movement. And stop motion is different from other techniques because you'll hear the phrase straight ahead animation. With stop motion, it's like you can plan a lot and you can like rehearse your shot and everything like that. But once you start, you're going straight ahead. You're not like skipping around to like, I'm going to make sure I'm going to like get this pose right and this pose right. And then I'll fill in the in-betweens. It's like you go, if you're doing a 200 frame shot, you start at frame 1 and you end at frame 200. Unless you're doing something crazy. I mean, you can like mess around with the frames if you're doing something really cartoony, but typically it's straight ahead. And if you realize that you mess up, you can't just like go back and revisit those few frames and fix them. You have to like delete everything that you've done up to that point, try to get the puppet or whatever you're animating back to where it was at that point, and then move from there. So, and it's also different because you're dealing with physical objects and gravity. So if you need something to jump or float, you need to figure out a way to hold the subject there for that frame that you're taking. And so you're dealing with like rigs. There's things called like winder rigs where you can turn these little knobs to move things up and down and left and right in the air. And then you have to keep in mind how you're going to erase those rigs later on. So there's a lot of dealing with physical challenges. Whereas, if you're doing 2D or CG, you're sitting at a computer, probably have like a nice ergonomic chair and stuff like that. Stop motion, you might have to be like reaching over some lights and underneath like a set piece and like slightly bending your back so your back is killing you and stuff like that. And then you're looking at your computer monitor and it's like really painful.
Well, you hope that you have like a good art puppet and like lighting and camera team to like help you keep the obstructions to a minimum, or good VFX team and stuff to like help you understand like, oh, that rig's not going to work if you do it this way, like do it behind and out this side, or all these little like tricks that everyone kind of holds on to in their head as like part of their department knowledge, and then we all kind of like brainstorm on set to make it the best case scenario for the animator because it is their workspace. Because you don't want them to do that gymnastics. Like sometimes it's unavoidable, but like you really want to try and make the gymnastics like the not part of that shot because it's hard enough just to animate.
Yeah.
What? That's a lot. There's a lot to digest there. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's super interesting. Especially like you bring in the as far as like a challenge, you have gravity in this sequence, so you're starting from 0 and going to 200, so to speak, with these frames. Like you've manipulated that puppet or whatever, so that causes difficulty if you make a mistake, right? Because then it may be, say if frame 33 is messed up, you realize that on frame 37, like going back, you're like, well, puppet looks completely different. I gotta, and I could see, and then you're also thrown out there too, kind of the rig and kind of the craftsmanship that goes in with, how that's displayed that way. You can take that out in post.
Yeah. It's like, there's, usually if you're working on at a studio on a show or something, before you start animating, you'll have like the VFX people come to take a look at what you're about to do. And you'll be like, I need to make this character fly, so I'm going to use this rig. And they'll just be like, all right, well, just make sure, either don't do it or make sure that the rig is only crossing like a really simple area to like cut off and not like going behind a bunch of hair or something like that. So it's hard to erase.
Feathery,
Yeah.
So maybe like more like a, basic background rather than something really intricate, because then that would be difficult for them.
Right. And then like, you after you've animated, you take a clean plate where like you remove your puppets or the subject from the background, so that the VFX department has just like a clean pass at the background, so that when they go to erase the rigs, they have the information that would be behind where the rig is. So it's complicated. You have to be aware of a lot of stuff. And cutting back is the worst part. What you were talking about, like you realize frame 37 that frame 33 is messed up. And if it's a character on a rig and they're doing crazy stuff, you're just like, oh my God, is it worth it to cut back? Should I cut back, or should I just keep going and like deal with my mistake? So, yeah.
There's and in talking about that, because you're trying to make things so smooth, which intuitively I would think means more images to do that. How to give what's a rough estimate? Like, how many frames does it take to animate a basic action like waving or something?
Yeah, it depends. Like every action, there's so many different ways to do it and different speeds and everything like that. So it could be somebody waving excitedly where it would just be like one frame here, one frame here, one frame here.
Yeah.
Or if somebody's doing like a subtle little thing like that, it could be like 3 frames one direction, 3 frames. You kind of just like, when you first start animating, you like map this stuff out, like how many frames am I going to do for this chunk of action? But then like as you get used to it, you just start to get a feel for how long it's going to take. And then if you're not sure how long something is going to take, you'll just over animate, and then you'll go back and like take out frames that don't need to be there to like make the timing a little bit tighter or something. And then also a lot of animators use video reference. So they'll just video themselves doing the action, and then they'll just have it on the screen next to their animation, so they don't really have to worry about like, am I going to hit my mark on time or anything like that. It's like the video's doing that work for you. It's
a lot of complicated animator math.
I call it like animator math because it's different from regular math, and you find yourself doing a really weird math to figure certain things out. Like if you're doing camera moves while somebody's walking and stuff like that, it's all kind of weird.
So it's sort of like, math of a curve, because everything needs to like ease in and ease out, which means you have a lot of tiny increments on the ends and a lot of big increments in the middle of a move. So it's sort of like complicated math, but it is also very intuitive at a certain point.
Yeah.
Like, again, we're going back to the proficiency, like leveling up, you gain a level of intuition after doing this for a while. But I mean, okay. And then taking into account the different angles, like that's another whole aspect, I guess. Cause you think about, you watch a sitcom or something where you get a camera angle change, a close up on someone's face, right? That's something also you have to calculate in. So let's say, again, I know this is highly variable, as you mentioned, even just with a simple wave of the hand, it depends. There's a whole lot of things that go into that, but giving just as general as possible, how long does it take to animate those frames? So even if you do have, a 2-frame wave, let's say, like what all goes into that and how long does that take?
So we try to think about averages for like animators time, mainly because like, you know, when you're dealing with like a bigger production schedule, you have multiple shots to do. It's not usually just one single shot. And so, you know, some shots only take a few hours, some shots take days or weeks. Like it depends on like the length of the shot, the complexity of the animation, or the things that are happening in that shot. Like if there's a camera move happening, that makes the animation more complicated for the animator. And then also you have to do a clean pass with that camera move. So you have to like have a programmable camera move, like to repeat that move, and or you have to be taking everything out every frame it's moving. So all of these things kind of like factor into this like general average. And so you kind of want to do that based on the type of animation that you're doing. So if you're doing this like really high level, like feature quality animation, you're not going to get very many seconds a day. Like you'd say what, like 2 at the most?
For working on a feature, it's like you'll get somewhere between like 2 to 4 seconds of animation done per day.
A day.
So it's like 8 hours of work. You're like, I got my wave. You're
That's
like at the end of the day, you're like,
that's your day, just 2 seconds. And then if you're working on something like kind of fast and, you know, a little loose, more like a Robot Chicken, like our quotas for that were really high. So they were like between 10 and 15 seconds sometimes, depending on crunch time. So it's sort of just like throw everything at it and see how fast you can go.
Yeah, working in TV, it's unforgiving in terms of like they want you to get 10 seconds a day no matter what. They don't care if you have a shot with like, you know, 20 characters in there or whatever. The goal is for you to get 20 seconds a day. So like as an animator, do whatever you can, take shortcuts, this and that. Of course, there are like exceptions, you know, like the animation director will be like, this shot is crazy, you know, just do what you can.
Give them a couple days. Yeah.
It's not like they're cracking a whip at you or punishing you.
It's also like considered an average because it's your average. Like some days you might have a bunch of like frames, like it's just a really easy shot for some reason, so you can get like 20 seconds that day. Like things that tend to be a little bit faster are things that have less things in them and generally less going on. So like a more like close-up shot where no one's walking or gesticulating wildly, you know, like you can get a lot more frames that way. But if you have like 7 characters walking through a set full body, that's going to take you a minute to get through all that. So your average that day is probably going to be pretty low.
To throw some numbers at you, if you're getting like 10 seconds a day and you're working, say you're doing 10-hour days at a studio, because sometimes you do 10-hour days, then you're getting like a second of animation per hour, which means you're taking 24 frames per hour. But on TV, you usually shoot on 2s, which means you shoot 2 pictures for every time you move the puppet. So really you're doing like 12 movement increments per hour to get 10 seconds a day in a 10-hour day.
Yeah.
Wow.
Animator math.
Yeah.
You just heard it here, folks. There you go. There's a breakdown. That was a proof.
Yeah.
First off, that's insane. I know that's kind of a generality. I know the variability, but that's crazy. I think one of the first things that anyone hears when they think about that, especially because, I mean, talk about a delayed gratification, right? When you're talking about that little movement, it's really hard to be like, again, like I got my wave, you know, like that's what you're holding on to, right? It's just such a small portion. And you add that in with how tedious that is. And you obviously have a timeline, like, you know, how do you keep patient?
Yeah, I'll say that there is like the idea that stop motion animators are like the most patient people, and our old boss, he used to say like, to be a stop motion animator, you need more patience than a large hospital or something like that. But like at some point you will lose it. You'll lose your patience. Like every now and then that happens to me where, you know, I'm trying to just move the character in this certain direction, but no matter how many times I touch it and nudge it, it stays like in the same spot. So then I just like lose it and I like crank it in one direction. I'm like, there. Then I have to like fix it, of course. But it is like what you're saying is like you don't immediately see the results of what you're doing because you're doing it one frame at a time, but also it doesn't feel like that. You just kind of feels like you're just doing a task, and you kind of get used to that pace, and at the end of the day you hit play and you see what you've done for the whole day and you're like, yeah, that's nice. Cool. Nice work that I did.
Yeah.
You're not really like, oh god, I've been working for 3 hours and I've only gotten like a few frames. What the hell?
It makes me like I'm sure some of your listeners have watched the Parks and Rec episode where Ben is so depressed he makes a stop motion and he goes to play it back for Chris, and it's like much shorter than he expects it to be, and he's like, what? No, I've been doing this for days. Like, and he's so upset that like he just hasn't really made any progress. I mean, it's kind of like that, but you like expect that at a certain point that you're just not like making that much progress, but you know that it's towards like something that's going to make you more progress in the long run.
Yeah.
I think it can get meditative at a certain point.
Yeah.
Too. It's sort of like painting, like where you just kind of like zone out after a little bit and you kind of just find your groove and keep going. But yeah, if you're expecting like instant gratification, no, that is not the job for you.
Yeah. I think on feature animation, if you're working on a feature film, I was feeling that when I was working on that because I was used to working on Robot Chicken where it's like 10 seconds a day. And then I find out I'm going to work on a feature and I'm like, oh, I only have to get like 3 to 4 seconds a day. Easy. And then I got there and, at the end of the day, I would like, have just over a second and I would feel terrible and be like, oh my God, I'm not going fast enough and blah, blah, blah. But on a feature,
they really do want the quality.
Yeah, they cared about the quality a lot.
Quantity, yeah.
But yeah, it's not, every now and then, yeah, you do get like that. Like, God, I've been working all day and I haven't gotten much done.
Yeah, but yeah, like you're saying, you have your moments. However, you are primed. You know that kind of going into it, and you do have some level of enjoyment, so you get some fulfillment from that. Where you're not going. You remember maybe someone like me who's not familiar, you throw us in there, you're like, I'm a complete failure. Kind of as you mentioned the Parks and Rec episode, right? To the uninitiated, they're going like, I'm not seeing anything, but you're going, hey, you also you pick up on those nuances. I know that even, as a college baseball player, when I watch a baseball game, which is, I would say a lot of people would say is boring, there are subtleties that I pick up on that someone else may not. And so there's kind of those things that kind of drive you a little bit more.
You can appreciate the craft of it when you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're animating and you're trying something subtle and new with the acting or something like that and you nail it, it's very exciting. So that's like something that keeps you going, is like, I'm going to try new things and make it interesting for myself.
I want to tap in because, stop motion, we mentioned there's kind of various different materials, I would assume, even just Robot Chicken versus say just solely clay and things like that. So what types of materials and props are commonly used in stop motion animation projects? And is that kind of just dependent upon the art style, or is it more functionally driven?
It's a bit of both. I mean, I'd say, your typical television or film production typically uses like a puppet that has a cured body of some sort, like either silicone or foam. Just so that way it's stable. They can put costuming on it. They can, give it a firm face, probably out of a resin of some sort. And, either give it a wig that with like hair that's been treated to be stiff or movable, or something firm. So they're like, that's like a more typical route for a puppet, just so that way it stays like on model, which is something that is hard to do if you have a bunch of people working on something. That's usually was the challenge with things like 2D animation or claymation, because that it's such a movable medium that if you have like 20 different artists working on it, face can shift a lot. And you can kind of see that in like old Disney movies and stuff sometimes when you like look at a character and you're like, that doesn't quite look like the character anymore. And then it comes back and then you're like, okay, that's the character again. But it's because like maybe the eyes have shifted or the eyebrow or something like that, and just feels a little different. But that can happen when you have lots of artists working on the same thing at the same time, and maybe some of them are a little bit newer and don't have a grasp of that as well. So it kind of eliminates all of those variables by having these like more firm bodies and faces to work with. You're not going to run off model with those. But with clay, like, you are managing that face the whole time, and the body probably.
So you're saying when you say model, like that's the base character, and you're trying to maintain that as like the continuity of it, which you kind of reflect the older Disney. You're like, hey, clearly, you know, the 17th person working on the film, you know, touched something and it's a little off on, you know, this kind of short segment. That's interesting. So, you know, animation, typically stop motion animation, is it usually clay, or is it usually, as you kind of mentioned, kind of these silicone models?
Yeah, it's usually silicone or foam with some sort of like resin head, just so that way all those things stay stable.
Yeah. Stop motion as a phrase or a term, kind of
like the umbrella.
Yeah, there's all these like different kinds of stop motion, like claymation, which uses clay.
And like only clay, really.
And then there's like pixelation, which is when somebody uses like a human being as a stop motion puppet. Like you've seen probably ads before where like there's like a human being that's been photographed to look like stop motion.
Or even just like hands in something. You know?
Yeah, that's called pixelation. Yeah. So like stop motion is the term that's the umbrella for all of those. And clay, I think, used to be used more in like the 90s and stuff because, well, I don't know why, but it's used.
It's had more of a 90s feel.
Yeah, I know it's used less today. It's used less today because it takes way longer than all the other kinds of stop motion animation. Like if you have a foam puppet with a resin head, you're kind of animating it and you're not worried about like clay melting or like falling apart or having to resculpt or the clay getting dirty or anything like that. Yeah. So clay takes a lot more time. And these days when you're shooting something, it's like how fast can you do it and for how little money can you do it? So clay doesn't really fit in that.
Though there are some, at least Aardman, we know, like protects clay in a lot of ways. So they still use it as like, you know, at least for their heads. If the bodies are, you know, something a little more rigid, like a foam with, you know, dressing on it, the head will still like have some clay element on it. So they still get that expression that they're like known for and those caricatures that they're known for.
You know, in talking about just the puppets, I'm just thinking, you know, trying to better grasp the scale of these things. So how large are these figures and sets?
We've got a couple behind us. They range. It's like we've animated some really tiny things, but typically like a full body human is somewhere between like 7 and 9 inches most typically. Sometimes they can be a little bit bigger, sometimes they can be a little bit smaller. Also, sometimes you make a really big one or make a really small one for a specific shot for a specific need. So like scale is kind of a fluid thing for stop motion too, because it has to be whatever best like suits the shot and like what you don't want to clump in later. Like what do you want to see practical? So sometimes we'll do like an oversized hand with an oversized prop. So you get that like close-up shot nice and crisp without it looking a little funky because it's tiny, you know?
Boom. This is awesome. What are some essential tools and equipment needed to get started with stop motion animation? So I know we kind of talked a little bit about the model. I mean, in Puppet, what kind of other basic things would you need?
I mean, you don't even need to start with Puppet or model animation. Like you could literally just start with an object, you know? A lot of folks start with toys. Lego is really popular just because they have little figures and they can move a little bit, but they're not like, you know, too articulate. So that way you can really focus on just controlling one thing or just a few things. Because really, like Scott was saying before, getting to know just those like increments and that timing and like how things work on a timeline, that stuff takes a little bit to get to know. So the fewer variables you have with whatever you're working with, the better. Because then you can really like focus on understanding like how fast something moves in space if you're just moving like a little ball or something. But yeah, you really just need a camera, some capture software, stable light, and a subject.
I think if you go online and you see people who are just starting with stop motion and they're asking like, how can I make this better? Usually it's like, do it in a room where you can control the light. So like when we do animation, the rooms are completely blacked off so that there's no outside light coming in. Because if there is, say you're doing it next to a window, and as the time of day is changing, it's like, you know, flickering. It's making your footage look like it's flickering. So you want a room or a space where you have control over the light. And then also a common mistake is not having your camera locked down, whatever it is that you're using, an iPhone or whatever. You need a tripod or some sort of situation where that isn't moving. Like I think a lot of beginners maybe just have it like leaned up against a book or something, and they're like trying to click the button on the phone and it's moving the phone every time they take a picture, or they think that they have to animate the camera moving around, and so the camera's moving all over the place. So
it's just really hard to focus on the thing that you're trying to learn when you're trying to control everything else around you and all that keeps twitching. Like it's much easier to just focus on, you know, your subject if you kind of control for the outside environment a little bit more. And it doesn't have to be like super high end or anything like that. You can do it with your phone. And there's some really cheap software. I think it's like $5. But even just having like a little like clicker, like a selfie clicker, you know, just so you have a remote shutter basically, and you're not touching your phone over and over again. You won't get that jiggle in your camera either. Even if you have like a slightly not stable setup, as long as you're not touching it, it probably won't move. But yeah, and then like close all your curtains and have like 1 or 2 lights to help you focus your energies.
Reduction of variables and then being consistent.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty much it.
Right, because you're now we're getting the light in here. We're not controlling that. We're adding that. Like as you mentioned, maybe we're not having a remote shutter, so we're clicking our phone, right? So now we're off a little bit. Scott, you mentioned you got maybe something in the background's falling over again and again. Back in the old days, you know, you got all these different kind of variables, and then that
clear
kind of
it out.
you're diminishing the quality, right? And it's also distracting, right? From whatever
it's distracting for you for learning too, because your eye keeps going to the thing that's moving that shouldn't be moving. And then it's also distracting, like if you're trying to use that as your portfolio stuff to, you know, get some feedback or to maybe try and get an internship or an apprenticeship or something, like it's going to be harder to share your work because there's a lot going on. So it's hard for someone to focus on your work if everything is moving.
Yeah.
So also shooting on something kind of firm is good. Like if it doesn't rock, better.
Like maybe not like an old card table.
Nope. No, right. That's not great.
If you can do a setup that isn't on carpet, that's ideal too, because if you have everything on carpet and you're stepping next to your tripod or your table, then everything's kind of like shifting just a little bit.
And all of this is like a very ideal situation. Like we have shot on carpet before, we have shot on tables that are not super stable. If you want to like do that kind of thing, you just have to be very careful as you go and touch things. Like it's more ends up being the control of the animator at that point. But that's sort of like next level animator. So you kind of want to start on easy mode where everything is just very firm. And then, you know, if something's a little jiggly, then that'd be your next level like animation.
Yeah, there is kind of an aspect to that. I know like with, say, for instance, saltwater fish tanks, right? Like a smaller fish tank is actually very hard to handle. And the same thing with firearms. Larger firearms it's easier to be proficient with them than smaller firearms. So you start throwing in all these variables. You go down easy street. It actually requires more expertise to handle the carpet and to handle the unsturdy thing and add in the camera angles. All of those things actually, again, require more expertise.
Yeah, totally.
one of the things that would seem very difficult to animate, or maybe it is someone speaking. So how do you animate speaking?
So you want to talk about like
So how do you animate somebody speaking? So the dialogue is recorded before you start.
Okay.
And then we use this software called Dragon Frame. And within Dragon Frame, you can drag in your audio. So you have like a waveform that shows the audio. And then it's hard to describe, but basically for every frame, you can like type in what sound the mouth is making. And then so when you're animating, and you have that information like on the screen next to your little animation window, and so you can see I'm on frame 24, and on that frame the mouth is making like an O sound. So I make like if you have like a sticker sheet of mouths, different shaped, you grab the O and you put it on the character, and so that's how you animate speaking.
And that's one of the first jobs you would have too as like an animation assistant, is doing the track reading for speech. So you'd be translating that, like what you hear as to what the sounds are, which are the phonemes,
Right, and that's called track reading.
Yes.
That's the track reading is doing that work for the animator before the animator gets to the shot. So that when the animator gets to the stage, they load up their software, and then the shot is already track read, which means they have the information of what sounds the mouth is making at what frame. And then, if you're the animator, you like act it out so that you know what sort of gestures and stuff the character is doing while they're talking.
And sometimes you can like exaggerate, what their mouth is doing depending on what the sound is too. Like even if they've said it's an O, like maybe it's like a huge one, like.
Yeah. It's like, the animation assistant will basically, they're suggesting what sound or what shape of mouth you should be using there, but it's ultimately up to the animator to decide, unless maybe in like a feature film production, they have like people who specialize in just like animating the faces beforehand, so that
they do replacement faces for that.
Right. So then the stop motion animator just like puts on whatever face and mouth it tells them to do on that frame.
So it kind of be done, have a batch of kind of mouths that they can kind of just put on there. Yeah. So at that point, there's like less subjectivity. You're just going to throw that on there.
Yeah, you're really following the instructions for that, because also sometimes it'll be like a brow piece and a lower face piece. So if you've seen puppets before that have like a seam line around their nose or their cheeks and their eyes, like it's because they've replaced like the whole lower face in case like they needed some cheek movement also with like the mouth movement, or if the eyebrows are also doing something different.
It sounds like you're really grateful for that software coming out after Coraline.
Oh, yeah. It quickly became industry standard, like very, very quickly.
Yeah, because before that came out, when we were working at like the furniture company, it's like you could do all that stuff, but it was kind of like all
clunky
different pieces of software that you were using. And, stop motion isn't super popular, so the software was very clunky. And
well, it was sort of like the older like filmmakers like doing special effects and stuff, you just kind of made the tool that you needed to get to where you needed to go. So like we used to use Frame Thief, which was black and white, and it was hooked up to a little security camera that was running live footage that you then put in the viewfinder of the camera. And so you have this very grainy picture from the viewfinder of the camera to your computer, projecting like this tiny image of like what this character looks like when you move it. It was very hard to like figure out what you were looking at with that one.
Yeah.
It was like very, also, the digital age has progressed significantly since then.
Yeah.
Cameras have gotten much smaller.
This software that we're using now that we're talking about, Dragon Frame, it had like everything that you need in it. So it's like you can do the track reading for the talking. If you need to animate the camera and you have like a motion control system, you can animate the camera within the software. You can animate the lighting from the software. So they've made it a lot more user friendly than it used to be. It's like it's all sort of like plug and play, whereas before it was like you probably had to like do your own
develop it yourself.
Yeah.
You kind of had to cobble everything together, and you're saying like, especially being a kind of a niche, animation way, it's like, and someone's like, I need this done. Therefore, they kind of had their own way of doing it, but no one kind of had some formal software that was kind of bundled a lot of these things together. And now you do have that, and it's greatly beneficial.
Exactly. And it actually has changed the game in other areas, like in terms of like motion control and stuff too, because other people are making motion control rigs for, shooting differently, like still with like the same cameras that we're using, or a smaller video camera for like, a more independent filmmaker or photographer doing time-lapse photography or something. But we can use those because Dragon Frame is so ubiquitous for stop motion that like these makers of the motion control rigs know that if they can sync up with Dragon Frame, that then they're more marketable to folks who are shooting stop motion in a more independent way. So there used to be like these massive, motion control rigs that were like, they're still like one-off, like beautiful, gigantic machines for like, doing large cinematography shots. But like we get to use like a much smaller rig that can still like perform pretty well, considering like, how much cheaper it is for us to be able to use it, and that it can still talk to the same software is also like, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned about kind of some job delegation when it comes to, these various aspects of animation to the uninitiated. Like, what are some of these jobs and what are their responsibilities?
There's so many jobs.
Yeah, there's a lot. So there's departments, and within those departments, there's like a hierarchy, all these different titles and roles. And so I can speak for the animation department, which is what I'm most familiar with. And it's like, starts with like the animation director is like the head of that department. Okay. And they they'll visit each stage with the director and talk to the animator about the shot coming up, ask them if they need anything. They'll also be a part of meetings where like all the departments watch the episode together, and then the animation director will be like, oh, can we do this instead because it's not physically possible to do it, that it's in the...
These are tech meetings where all the heads of department are there.
Right. So the animation director...
Yeah, so that way you have everyone with their specialty offering.
We got a cross-functional team meeting,
Yeah. Yeah, we're like trying to brainstorm how this impossible shot that, the animation director is calling out like, this isn't physically possible. Now you have like art director, the like DP, the director of photography, the VFX supervisor, the head of puppets, the head of costumes, all in there trying to think about like the little parts and pieces that are making up the shot and making it so complicated to like aid in what the animator is going to get in the end.
Right. And then, so to make it quick, because we could talk about the roles all day. It's like animation director, and then below them would be like the lead animator. And it has all different kinds of titles because I don't know why. It'll be like supervising animator, lead animator, whatever else. But the lead animator will sort of be more in charge of just the animation and making sure that like all the other animators are staying on model for different characters or coming up with the way different characters act. And then there's like the animators do all the animation. And then there's, animation assistants. There's also the animation coordinator up there somewhere who helps with like managing, if an animator calls out sick and stuff like that.
They're also the production liaison. So like they're directly talking with production. And so like some of these like hierarchies, they cross all of the departments. So like in the art department, you have the art director and maybe the production designer sitting on top. Sometimes we don't have a production designer. The production designer would also talk to like puppets and costumes because they're kind of the eye in the sky for what all of fabrication is going to look like moving forward. And maybe even to VFX and the DP, because like it really is the overall look of whatever we're working on.
So it's kind of like a horizontal org structure, right?
Yeah. So, and like everybody's just kind of like caked in across the top, and then they all have a tree below them. And there's usually like a lead or two, especially if like in the department is like a little bit more complicated. Like I was in the art department, so it'd be like scenic painting is a whole group, then you have set dressing as a whole group, and then you have building as a whole group. So, and even those can fracture into smaller leads and stuff depending on how complicated your project is and how specialized certain things are for that project. And same thing like puppets. You can have people who specialize in hair or molding and casting or the sculpture side of things or 3D printing or 3D modeling, because there is a lot of 3D computer work that also happens in stop motion. And then in costuming, there's a whole range of different skill sets with soft goods. So, there's a whole other tree in there. VFX, sometimes you have to make 3D models to build out areas of the set that you can't keep building on.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also just compositing. So there's so many aspects of VFX and post and editing and all of that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's all in-house. Sometimes, you go to different houses for different things. I know it's more common in the UK that they have fabrication houses that create all the fabricated assets for something and then they shoot it elsewhere. But in the States, they tend to be all in-house. I think I covered most. Oh, and then I missed camera and lighting, which is on stages. You have the DP who's basically in charge of, what the look of everything on camera is. And then they have specialists for, how the electricity is run and how the lights go up and who's touching the lights and how do they arrange them and who handles the camera and the lenses and all of that. So it's everyone kind of has a specialty in this whole process. And then you have the production team who's basically just talking to each individual communicator on the coordinator level or the production manager level, and the heads of department level. So all of those people are your communicators across the board, and they all communicate to production so they can keep track of your overall schedule and whether you're on budget and whether you're on time and how far out of sync are we with what we said we're going to do and when we're going to land.
Yeah, that you get into all that good project management stuff, right?
Yeah.
Especially the timelines, and that has its own hierarchy too over each individual project.
And they all kind of have similar naming conventions, so that does help, in each of those hierarchies. So
you kind of carry that HR title again to kind of that different department, right? So you kind of have that synonymous.
Yeah. Sort of supervisor or lead and head of department and coordinator or manager. So yeah, those all kind of track in similar spots across departments.
Wow.
Yeah. So it can be really big or it can be really small. Scott and I are our own studio, so we wear a bunch of different hats each. And it's just the two of us. So, but we've worked on those teams that have, 100+ people.
So what's the separation of duties between the two of you? I mean, you got a bunch of different hats on. What are kind of the strengths of each of you?
Yeah, we're very clearly split because when we were working in the big studios, I was in the animation department always. Alexis was in the art department.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of the perfect blend because I think we both started towards the bottom and worked our way through both departments. So we sort of saw all the things that we have to know. And as I would be animating, I'd be asking the lighting people questions and stuff like that, because I knew that at some point I'd want to do my own stuff.
And I was more concerned with making sure that I was communicating effectively to production. So my production brain was a little bit more tuned in about how to communicate budgets and scheduling. So it's my skills were more in that reign of just really highly organizational and fine tuning like math stuff to be able to communicate like money, basically. I don't know. It's a really silly way of saying that, but
yeah, you have to. There's something to be said. You have to kind of know what other people value, and you have to learn how to communicate that. I mean, that's important. Whether you're reaching out to two people to talk about a podcast or whatever the case is, you kind of have to find those levers and be able to speak to those.
Yeah. Alexis is definitely like she's the front end person in this duo. Like she does a lot of the communication and
like the design start.
Yeah, like in a stop motion production, it's like you start with scheduling and budgeting and designs,
storyboarding,
and fabricating and stuff like that. And then at some point is when I'll step in and it'll be like a lot of my responsibilities, which is like the lighting and camera stuff, the animating, and then we sort of both meet again at the end for like the VFX and the editing and that stuff.
Yeah, because sometimes I'll like clean up shots as he drops them for me, so that way I can keep on top of them and move them forward. But we don't really decide on any compositing magic until we're both together, and then we can kind of like brainstorm a little bit together, like if something's working or not working. And then we also do our own sound a lot of times too.
It's great to hear. It's great to hear kind of how you had two different areas, and again, you were able to kind of come up and get exposure to all these various different things, and then come together with kind of these different, things that you've been imprinted with to work on something together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Working in the studio system was like rough, but it was also very helpful for our skills and our careers. It's sort of like this accelerator that you enter that just like boosts everything very quickly because you're working a lot and you're working very quickly and you're learning from all the other people that are working around you. And so, yeah, we eventually got to the point where it was like, wow, we know enough where we could probably do our own stuff.
Mm-hmm. And then you're also like deeply trying to remember, like, how did I do that thing so long ago? And now how do I do it on my own? When before I like handed it off to, the lighting team or something. This time I have to remember like what pieces did they use to connect that light to this thing, and it didn't blow the tiny light.
Yeah, the joys of delegation. Until then you're like, darn, I have to do that myself. You're like, what was that, right?
You're like, I am the PA and the executive producer.
For aspiring stop motion animators, what advice would you give them to get started and improve their skills? Outside of, I know we kind of had some general things, but maybe just some general advice for them.
Well, one is just start. You don't want to drag your feet too long on just like the practicing part. There's lots of places you can look for just like beginner basics, like just kind of tutorial drills of like, oh, these are the things we need to start practicing. There's a lot of good books for beginner animators. The Richard
Williams.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this animation book that everybody has, everybody who's in animation. It's Richard Williams, and I think it's called the Animation Bible, or no, the Animator's Survival Kit.
Yes, that.
But it is like the Bible for animation.
It is. It's basically all of the things you need to practice, because they're all the things that you're going to get thrown at some point in your career. Actually, when we moved to LA and you were like, I've never done four-legged animal animation before, didn't you refer back to that?
Yeah, it was funny because when I got the job in LA, I was joking with my friends like, oh, that'd be crazy if like I got there and I had to do like an animal walking or something like that, because I'd never done that before. And as soon as I got there, I was on a show called Dinosaur Office, which was a bunch of dinosaurs like walking around and interacting. So I would bring the animator survival kit with me to work and like very desperately like study like what leg moves first. But yeah, I think what Alexis was saying, most importantly for like people who want to get into it, is just to do it, because it's like so easy to sit back and be like, well, I don't have this thing, so I guess I can't start. And then maybe you go online and ask people like, how do I get started? When really like
just start.
if you want to do it, if you're just starting and you want to figure out how to do it, you don't need to have the best equipment, and your final product doesn't need to be able to be screened on theaters in theaters and stuff like that. So it's like, just do some experimenting.
And I do find that sometimes when folks just want to get to that final product too, like they skip the part that is the most beneficial for them in the long run, which is just the like getting to know how it works. Like when you just want to get to the end, like you're going to be less happy with how it looks because you didn't practice all those skills to like get you to that performance that you really want. Or sometimes people get really focused on the like fabrication side, like I need a set, I need a puppet. And like, if you're really drawn to those things, you can just make those things and go for fabrication. Like you don't have to then animate them if you are not that interested in animation. Because sometimes I find that too, where like a lot of folks will get to the point where they're like, I'm animating this thing and I really hate it. Like animation sucks. And then they're like, but I really enjoyed making this chair and, you know, this other thing. And I was like, well, that's a job too. Like you can do that part instead of the part you really don't like.
Yeah. I think there's definitely something to be said for, you know, enjoy the journey, right? You know, if you're over here, you're doing something and you're laboring over something and it's not enjoyable, maybe pick the journey you enjoy, you know? And I think you pick up on that for people that don't enjoy that journey, because you get that kind of, I don't want to learn how to fish, I want to fish kind of mentality. Like I just want that end product, right? And maybe, you know, maybe because it seems cool or is popular, you know, maybe there's another journey out there that you can take that you will, you know, find satisfaction in that process. Maybe it is just making the chair or whatever the case may be outside
you can make
of that.
a really awesome chair.
Yeah. You can. Possible. You absolutely can. Last thing here. All right. What can people do to find out more about the two of you and the work you do?
We are online. Our website is threadwood.com, and you can find us at Threadwood for a lot of things and at _ for some stuff.
Yeah, we're
he knows the specifics.
We're all over social media. We try to keep up with all that stuff. So we're on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, or I guess it's X now, or something stupid like that. And we have our own website, and it's all connected. In our little blurbs, we have like links to our personal profiles if you want to see like our separate individual artwork and stuff like that. But yeah, it's pretty easy to find us, I think. And we're on YouTube and Vimeo, everywhere that we can figure out how to use. Like
we'll we're there. Yeah.
Okay.
We tried Snapchat once. I don't think that's
that was not for us.
Set up for what we're doing. I couldn't figure it out.
Also, I just didn't get it.
We'll be sure to include all the links to the things that you've referred to, as well as the things that promote you and your accounts in the description of this podcast episode. I just want to say, again, Alexis Scott, thank you for sharing your time and knowledge today. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
That wraps up our conversation with Alexis and Scott. We talked about how speaking is animated, the different animation jobs available, and the difficulties you'll face when animating with clay. Go to this episode's show notes to see any resources Alexis and Scott mentioned during our episode. And lastly, subscribe to the Simple Questions podcast to get notified when our latest episodes are released. Thank you for listening, and remember to keep asking questions.